Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. With your host, Dr. Drumm McNaughton, CEO of The Change Leader, a consultancy that helps higher ed leaders holistically transform their institutions. Learn more at changinghighered.com. And now, here's your host, Drumm McNaughton.
Thank you, David. Our guest today is Dr. Stephen Standifird, president of Bradley University. Stephen has a long pedigree in higher ed, having served at multiple top institutions, including Butler University, University of Evansville, and the University of San Diego. He's a consummate strategist, but not the traditional higher ed strategist. He's what I would call a turnaround specialist. His passion is innovation, ensuring students can discover and explore their true calling and purpose in life. And he'll be joining us to talk about how Bradley's becoming a center for student innovation through using a turnaround mentality. Stephen, welcome to the show.
Thrilled to be here.
Well, it's great to have you on. I've been looking forward to this conversation. When we chatted a couple of days ago, I was just amazed at all the things that are going on at Bradley. And it seems like you're really putting your stamp on Bradley, and it's becoming very unique in many ways.
Yeah, and I'm happy to share a little bit about that. It's interesting. It's unique, and to some extent, I would say a lot of what we're doing today really does go back to the founding roots of the organization. One of the things we're doing is we're trying to think differently. Higher ed's a very interesting environment, and you know this well. For over 100 years, we saw this constant growth in enrollment. You go back to about 1870 up to about 2010. Constant demand, and then as a result, what's happened is we're in an industry where it's been very easy to adopt this mentality: if we build it, they will come, right? So it's just that let's just do what we think makes sense and move forward with that. And we've perhaps lost the art of really trying to understand what today's students are really looking for. So part of how we're thinking differently is we're looking at our environment as a turnaround mode. How do we function differently? How do we be more aggressive in some of the things we're doing? And one area specifically is in our strategic planning process. We began the process actually by interviewing prospective students. We talked to about 1,600 prospective students and used that as the basis of our strategic planning process. And I believe that is perhaps a little bit different than what you often see in higher education. And it was really insightful. It really helped us understand how we have to think differently to really do the best we can to prepare today's students for success. And when I say that ties back to our tradition, we began as an institution that thought differently. We were founded by an individual named Lydia Moss Bradley, a very successful businesswoman. We were founded in 1897. And if you think about what she was able to do, National Bank Board, successful businesswoman, really got us started. Very cutting edge in the late 1800s. So that thinking differently, pushing boundaries is really in our very DNA.
Well, you know, it's really interesting you bring up the surveying of prospective students. I've only heard one other institution do this, and that is Philly Mantella up at Grand Valley in Michigan. And they have got an initiative called REP4, REP4, and it's a consortium of 6 schools that are using market research and doing a lot of innovation. And that is what Philly has been doing, is running focus groups with prospective students, high schoolers. You know, what is it that you want in education? I think it's brilliant. Yeah. I mean, as you were talking about what you're doing, it's like, oh my gosh, why can't more institutions do the kind of market research that you guys are doing? And that's really what it boils down to.
Yeah, and it's interesting, and part of what I've been trying to deconstruct over the last year is why doesn't that happen more often? And I think it comes down to the fact that for over a century, we didn't have to do it. And then as a result, it's been one of those, if we build it, they will come, and we did, and they did. So we didn't have to be as an industry market centric. But that's changing, because if you follow those enrollment trends, you begin to see things starting to flatten off around 2010. And we're expecting even greater declines in the coming years based on the demographic data that we're looking at today. And I see this not as it's interesting. you hear about the, enrollment getting, the demographic cliff, all these different things that people talk about. And there's a lot of anxiety in the industry about the forthcoming changes. I actually get excited about it because it creates an opportunity for us to think differently, to really get back to really understanding and designing our universities around the needs and interests of today's students.
And that is so critical. One of the biggest concerns that I've had with all of the CARES Act and all the funding that's gone into higher ed, which, God knows it certainly was needed.
Yeah.
But you see a lot of institutions going, oh my gosh, we can go back to the way we were. And even build back better. I was saying that they're talking about another, 50 or 100 billion with that, if and when it gets through. We can't perpetuate, it's like Einstein's definition of insanity. It's doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. It doesn't work.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've been watching issues with the CARES Act, and I think there was a lot of predictions that the pandemic and some of the outgrowth of that would create an acceleration of the changes in higher ed. Of course, all of that additional funding, I think, delayed that. And one of the concerns I have is it's just delaying the inevitable. Mm-hmm. I think it's naive to think that things are ever going to get back to normal. I'm not sure we would want them to get back to normal because, again, I see this as a real opportunity for us to think differently and really understand what today's students need and what they're interested in their education. And my biggest concern is that we're just delaying something that I think is healthy for the industry. So the sooner we can begin starting, which is why we talk a lot about on campus. I spend a lot of time talking with my senior leadership team. We use articles around turnarounds. How do you manage in a turnaround? And I just think it's a healthy way for us to be thinking about the organization as we move forward.
Mm-hmm. I think so. I read this morning, there's another university, a small Christian college, I think it's out of Ohio, that's, shutting its doors.
Yeah, it's one of the things is when you saw this constant growth in enrollment demand, one of the things that allowed is it allowed for a rather rapid expansion of universities. It depends on how you measure this number, but it's a surprisingly contestable number to measure. But the number of colleges and universities in the U.S. right now is somewhere around 4,600. Mm-hmm. There are roughly 4,600 Dairy Queens in the U.S. So that means as you go across the country, you are as likely to run into a college and a university as you are a Dairy Queen. And by almost any measure, we're a saturated market. We're a saturated market with a declining demand. Mm-hmm. And that just screams turnaround opportunity. If you go back and look, in most industries, you experienced this in the 1980s when there was a drop in GDP for the first time in many, many years. For a variety of reasons, higher education has been shielded from that, but those days are over. And so it's a real opportunity for us to think differently and to use some of these concepts from turnaround as really a way to navigate through some of these issues.
Well, as you brought up, obviously that the Dairy Queen analogy is fabulous. And I was thinking, just with mine hold the nuts. And it's like, okay, does that apply to Dairy Queen or does that apply to universities? I don't know.
Right. Exactly.
And so, with that, assuming that turnaround mentality, I think, is really critical. And that was one of the things that I think really makes you unique is you're doing well financially. You've got a great CFO who thinks differently. Yeah. But if you're approaching things from a turnaround perspective, it's like, okay, how can we do this better?
Right.
How do we change what we're doing? Because the model doesn't work except for a Harvard or a Yale, your Ivies, your Stanfords, really big institutions who've got endowments, over $1 billion.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's, it's interesting when you start looking at the turnaround research and the conversations around what you have to do in a turnaround, it does force you to think a little bit differently. One of the things that has been kind of a constant theme in higher education, at least in my experience in higher education, has been this focused on costs. It's all about costs. One of the things that turnaround expert will tell you is cash is king, right? It's not about cost, it's around cash. And the way you increase your financial well-being is through investment. And so what are those things that are going to give you a return on investment? One of the things we did is to help us navigate through this process. We have a relatively new CFO. She actually joined us from the private equity world. She has no higher education background. She has degrees, but she's never worked in higher education. And it's interesting. I remember even when we were interviewing her, a number of my colleagues were like, she's outstanding. Her one challenge is she has no higher education background. And what I heard is she's outstanding. And one of her advantages is she has no higher education background because she doesn't come in constrained by that thinking. So when we see an opportunity to invest, and when I first arrived, we weren't measuring cash flow. And somebody asked me early on, what keeps you up at night? Not knowing cash flow kept me up at night, but we now measure that weekly. So we know where we can afford to make investments, and we're making those investments. And that's part of a turnaround approach, is be very clear on your financial situation. Universities talk a lot about deficits. You can incur a deficit and survive. You run out of cash, you're done. And so we focus a lot on cash as part of our turnaround. And then the other key turnaround piece that I think is absolutely critical is customer centricity. Do you really have a sense of what today's market is looking for? And if you don't, you're not going to survive in a turnaround situation. And if you do, that's kind of your path to salvation.
Well, those are two key points, investment and knowing what your market wants. Who is your customer? Who do you view your customer as?
Yes. So it's interesting. I was a strategy professor for many years, and we talk about this in my strategy classes, and I'm a big fan of follow the money, right? When you follow the money, you know who your customers are. And there's a big debate because some folks will say, well, it's companies or it's the community or it's, you know what, if you follow the money, it's the students. The students fundamentally are the people that are making the decision to join or not join your organization to pursue their education. Now, the opportunities that exist for them post-graduation are a pull-through, right? That's going to influence the students, no doubt. So it's something we have to pay attention to. But fundamentally, when you follow the money and you pay attention to who do you ultimately exist to serve, for us, it's our students. And in fact, we've even gone to the phase where we don't even use the term student because that often comes with a lot of luggage. Because when we do that, the first inclination, well, that is a 17 to 18-year-old high school student. Actually, students come in all shapes and sizes for us. It's online students, it's graduate students, it's continuing education students. We have a lifelong learning program that has a wonderful collection of students that are engaged with us. So we often use the term learners because that carries less baggage than the term student. But fundamentally, that's who we serve.
Okay. Well, and that makes perfect sense. We always, and with my firm, we always refer to higher education as part of the talent supply chain.
Yeah.
And you're taking this widget and molding this widget who just happens to be a two-legged widget with a mind and all of that, and you're molding them so that they're ready to pursue the career of their dreams.
Absolutely. Yep.
And without that mentality that you're serving, who is your customer, you're going to fail.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, and that was one of the real takeaways for us when we did this survey of prospective students. And it was a collection of online students, graduate students, undergraduate students. I'll even go a little deeper than that. Yes, what are their dreams and aspirations? And what's interesting, one of the things that they were telling us in that is it career, yes, but it even transcends that. What today's students are really looking for, what they are telling us in the research is they're looking for a life of meaning and purpose. So a big part of our thinking differently is careers matter, majors matter, but it's only part of the pie, if you will. There's a bigger picture around we literally came up with the phrase, help me achieve the life I want. And that's a much more complex piece. So what we've been looking at is breaking down those disciplinary boundaries. And part of our responsibility is helping students both discover what it is they really want and then finding out how to pursue it. And interestingly, that often breaks through disciplinary boundaries. So one of the ways we're thinking differently is come here. We're not going to tell you what door to go through. We're going to help discover thousands of doors together and then give you the skills you need to be successful in what it is you want to do. And that's part of what we've discovered in our research with our students.
Which makes perfect sense. One of my previous guests, Jamie Cassup, who's done a lot of work with Michael Crow there at Arizona State. Yeah. He said the fundamental question that you have to answer, a student has to answer, is what is your passion?
Yes.
What is your passion?
Absolutely.
It's not what do you want to be when you grow up. It's really what problem do you want to solve And how do you want to solve that?
Yes.
And what do you need to know to solve that problem?
Absolutely. I love that phrase. What is your passion? And what we often talk about is come here. We will help you become the best version of yourself. Not of a prototype that we've developed, but of you. Who are you? What is your passion? What do you want to accomplish? And you come here, we'll help you discover that.
And, just throwing in a little political thing here, you've got to have good academic freedom to be able to do that, because you don't necessarily know what the students want. They need to be exposed to all different sides of the argument so they can make up their mind instead of you telling them how they should think.
Absolutely. And exposing them to that diversity of opportunities and experiences is really critical. So we'll do that, obviously, in our curricular setup. That academic freedom piece becomes critical in that conversation. The other thing that we think is absolutely critical to that is a fairly intense experiential component. One of the things we talk about, we're in a wonderful city here, Peoria, Illinois, and we have conversations around economic development. And we do a lot of work with the city. Is that a sociology question? Is it an economics question? Is it a political question? The answer is yes, right? So that's the kind of thing we want to get our students connected with. Have that experience so that you recognize the totality of opportunities. And so we think the curricular piece is important, but the more and we're working with a lot of community partners on how do we give our students these intense experiences that allow them to really discover the things that really drive them.
Mm-hmm. I think the university that really does an incredible job with this is Texas A&M. A great story that I got from Danny Pugh, who's their VP for student services. He said every faculty member is a liaison, and he happened to be the A&M marching band liaison. And so they were doing the I think it was the Rose Parade, or it might have been the Cotton Bowl Parade. And one of the organizers of the parade came up to him and said, we have this question. And Danny just pointed over at the band director, which was a fourth year student, and said, that's the person you need to talk to.
Yeah.
They put people in leadership positions, students in leadership positions, to help them grow.
Yeah.
They're very successful. In fact, the joke that goes around A&M is, what do you call an Aggie graduate 5 years after they've graduated? The boss.
Yeah. Right. Right. Those kind of experiences are priceless. And one of the things we've got to build into our organization is the flexibility to allow those experiences to happen. Yes. One of the examples, I share this, he's giving me permission to share. We have a young man who just recently graduated named Pierre Paul. Pierre came to us from Ohio, came here to study political science.
You actually let somebody from Ohio into an Illinois university? I'm shocked.
We're a welcoming and inclusive environment. We're happy to bring everyone who wants to come discover themselves is welcome here. So Pierre shows up, and he's a political science major. On our speech team, we have a world-class speech team, and he's going to be a politician, and his path is set. And then he tells me that literally in a dream one night, he has some colleagues that are hard of hearing, and they were having a difficult time ordering at a Starbucks. And so he had a dream that he was going to create an app that translates sign language into verbal language. And apparently that's really complex. Nobody's been able to quite figure that out. Microsoft and Google can do it if you wear a glove, but he didn't want people to have to wear a glove. So he reached out to computer science. He reached out, there's a faculty member in computer science he worked with an engineering. He reached out to the business faculty. And he launched a program called We Hear You, and they now have an app that converts sign language into verbal language.
Wow.
Microsoft has talked to him. Google's talked to him. He hasn't sold. He's like, I'm a mission-driven guy, and this is what I do. Now, what's interesting is you think about what he did, and he did graduate with a political science degree. He actually got a master's from us as well in public administration. And to the best of my knowledge, nothing related to developing that software can be found in the political science or the Masters of Public Health degree program. But it doesn't matter. He's not here to get a degree. He's here to find his passion and learn how to do that. And we did that for him. And that's the real key, I think, moving forward, is to help students have that flexibility that when they come in, they can find the path that's right for them. And we don't constrain that. We encourage that and we support that. And that's how we have to think differently about the universities moving forward.
Well, it kind of reminds me of the way we used to talk about school years ago. An undergraduate, you're training someone how to think.
Absolutely.
A master's program, you're making someone a specialist in a particular area, and a PhD, you're bringing in new knowledge.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's what you've done with this young man, is you've taught him how to think, and you've given him the environment to where he can explore what is important to him and bring that forward.
Yes. And that last point you highlight is so critical to us. And we hear it's critical to today's students. We want to help them become the best version of themselves, not of some predefined definition of what we think is best or what we think learning and discovery looks like. Let them help us identify what that means for them. And then we step in and say, great, let us help you achieve that. And I tell you, it's a very different model, and it's causing us to have to think very differently. We're having to tear down boundaries that have previously existed for literally centuries and to start thinking differently. But again, it goes back to the very founding of who we are. So it's something we get pretty excited about.
Yeah, and I can see that. Now, some of those boundaries you've got to tear down. I'll bet your faculty governance process is a little bit different than what we'd see at a, quote, traditional university. Yeah,
so that's interesting. The conversation on faculty governance is an interesting one. And one of the things that we talk a lot about is there's a big difference between input and decision making. And we've had a lot of conversations around, getting my colleagues engaged in a lot of conversations and things that they're involved with and input on certain things is critical. And in some areas, their decision making ends up being important, right? When we're starting to think about, if we want to develop a new program in physical therapy, actually we already have a program, but if we want to do physician assistant, for example, obviously my colleagues really have to play a key. What does that mean? What does that look like? What's the curriculum look like? And then there are other decisions where we'll inform our colleagues on what we're doing. We just did a major debt restructuring. The CFO led that. She's on that. So a lot of what we're doing is let's understand where those boundaries exist between decision-making, accountability, and being informed. The other thing that I'm a big fan of, the governance process, well designed, has got to be able to be flexible and move fast. Our strategic planning process took months, not years. And ultimately, it was the board that approved the strategy. And there was some controversy to that initially, but it really helped us move quickly. And in the final analysis, I feel comfortable in saying that everybody recognizes that we're moving in the right direction, and that speed allowed us to do some things we wouldn't have been able to do otherwise.
Well, it's critical that you do, especially in a mature, declining market.
Yes.
You see a market opportunity, you have to be able to move quickly, and you have to have the flexibility in your plan.
Yeah.
And you've got to have the shared vision with, this is the outcome you're looking for. This may not necessarily be the way that we get to that outcome.
Yeah. And you don't need to, it's interesting. A lot of it is improving processes, not necessarily destroying processes. Mm-hmm. One of the things we introduced is we introduced a new program approval process. The way it used to work and works in most universities is there's a curricular review committee that spends a long time massaging, thinking about curriculum, developed a program, and eventually it comes to the administration for final approval around positions in finance and such. We've flipped that around. And so now, to get a new program approved, it has to first be approved by me, by our provost, by our CFO. And you actually have to put together a profit and loss statement. And it has to actually show a return on investment in 3 years. And if it doesn't, it has a natural sunset clause built into it. I heard somebody say once, if you want to live forever, come back as an academic program. And there's some regrettable amount of truth to that. The challenge with that is it doesn't give our colleagues the freedom to be creative and think differently and try things. And what this new approval process does for us is if it looks profitable, this is a great way too. We also will say, if you think this has legs and you want to build in new faculty lines, build it in there. And if we think it makes sense, we'll support that. And then it goes through the academic curricular approval process. But we are strongly of the mind, please don't waste your time looking at something we know we can't launch. Let's focus on those things that we think can be beneficial. We introduced that program last year, and we got 3 new programs approved in 3 months. So once it got through the administrative, the faculty figured out we're serious. We're prepared to support this. We have a new master's in game design, one of our key areas of expertise. And the speed at which that got approved was phenomenal. And it went through a relatively traditional governance process, but with clear support that the administration was behind it. And as a result, it went much faster. So part of it is just thinking of processes differently.
Yeah, and that's so critical whenever you're doing any kind of change. If you think of things like an iceberg where you've got 10% is the output, that's out what you see. You've got your processes, you've got your structures down at the bottom, and then the water is all the mental models.
Yes.
And if you can change the mental models and you can change the structure, the processes will follow and the output will change.
Absolutely. And this is one of the things that's been really helpful us in terms of thinking turnaround, bringing in a CFO from outside of higher education. It's so interesting. She and our provost could not work better together, right? They've become really great partners. And she'll periodically go to our provost and say, well, why do we do this? And his initial response, well, that's how we've always done it. And he catches himself and says, well, that's a good question. Why do we do it this way? So it's really allowed us to see processes with new eyes and to be thinking differently. And part of what we're trying to do is help our processes move us forward and get out of the way where they need to so that we can continue to move and be dynamic relative to the demands of today's students.
Well, it's so critical that you do that. And one of the things I think that really helps you is the composition of your governing board.
Yeah.
I mean, when I looked at the list of people on there, it's a who's who in corporate America.
Yeah. Yeah, they really, the board has been a phenomenal support. In fact, as we went through our strategic planning process, the board was incredibly supportive of this concept that the board owns the strategic planning process. And that was different than had been done here in the past. There was no faculty vote on the strategy. There was a board vote on the strategy. But as a result, they feel engaged and to some extent accountable for the strategy, as they should. Mm-hmm. And they've been really, really good partners. And it's this wonderful combination of being challenging and supportive, but constantly pushing us to think differently. And a big part of the reason I'm comfortable pursuing the changes that we're pursuing is I know the board has got my back on this. It's something they're excited about as well. And I think if you start thinking about how do you move a higher education institution forward, if you have to have a supportive board. That's I think job number one.
Oh, absolutely. And your processes of bringing on new board members have got to be, you've got to be able to mirror the culture. It's got to be a culture of transformation, but at the same time, you've got to have the right skills to be able to do the oversight that's necessary.
Yeah, and we look at that when we're looking at new board members. We look at kind of their background, their demographics, but a big part of that is what skills do they bring. So we've got people with marketing backgrounds, finance backgrounds. We have a board member, he's a vice president for transportation with Amazon. And boy, does he challenge us in some interesting ways. but it's phenomenal, right? I mean, we've gained so much because he'll share with us, well, here's how we think about it at Amazon. And so there are things we can integrate into how we're functioning as well. A former managing partner from Accenture is one of our board members, and each of them brings unique skill sets that really help us. They're part of that think differently, continue to push processes, and to make sure that we're being as adaptive as we can be.
Yeah, it's like that old Einstein cartoon. That's something, if you try and tell a fish that it's supposed to climb a tree, it's going to feel like it's a failure its entire life. What you do is you challenge the processes in different ways and you get people to change their thinking. And it's like, oh my gosh, we can do that. I mean, I remember one time the most powerful 4 words you can tell a child is, you can do that.
Yes.
You can do that.
Yes. I'll periodically get the question, what's my single biggest challenge? And I was actually having a conversation yesterday with one of my colleagues. We need to, and I would say this is true throughout higher ed, think bigger. We often see constraints and reasons why we can't do things in higher education. And a big part of what we've got to do moving forward is remove those barriers and think bigger. Think about the possibilities and what can be done. And to your point earlier, having a board that recognizes and appreciates that and supports that has been phenomenal for us.
It's critical. And the ability to innovate, unless you've got that supportive board where they say, okay, go take risks. Don't be stupid about it, but go take risks, try new things. If you fail, pick it up, learn from it, move on.
Yeah, so smart risks is the term we often use. Take smart risks. And this is partly why we built into this new program approval process a sunset clause, right? Because I want you to be thinking about cutting edge, risky programs. And it's okay if they don't work, and we'll shut them down. And that's not a don't come back. That's a great, you tried, let's bring another one forward that we think has a greater possibility. And if we're being aggressive in this, we have a number of programs we're introducing every year, some of which are successful, some are not. I worked with a CEO when I was in San Diego, a guy named Gary Ridge from WD-40. And at WD-40, they're very fond of talking about they don't have failures, they have learning moments. So if we have one of these programs that we launch that doesn't work, for example, great. What do we learn from that? And how do we use that information to inform our next program launch? But boy, part of that is, you're alluding to a really important challenge for higher education. This fear of failure often gets in the way of us being innovative and creative in the way we function. And that's something that we've got to figure out how to overcome if we're going to be innovative as an industry.
Yeah. One of my favorite quotes is from Jim Reed. I'm a big proponent of Cousys and Posner's The Leadership Challenge. And one of his favorite quotes is along the lines of, "It's always exciting for me to see what people can do when they're given the opportunity. So often they far exceed anyone's expectations, even their own."
Yeah. Boy, I love that quote. And one of the things that I think is key to making that work is also aligning incentives so that people are able to be aggressive and to take risks. One of the things we'll be doing this next year is we're introducing an incentive-based budget process. And what we're going to do is each of the college deans now will basically be responsible for their own P&L. And what it does is it gives them permission to experiment, right? Go out and try things. You have the resources to do that. And what I love about it is it not only gives them opportunity, but it also gives them accountability to that. And to me, that is really the art of being able to take those risks and moving forward. And some will succeed, some will fail. And as long as you have a good mix of those that are succeeding and failing, it'll work out well for the organization.
And a CFO who can pick up the pieces when it happens.
Right. That's right. That's right. Well, a big part of that too for us is, and then you got to really understand your finances. So one of the things we've done this last year is our financial reporting processes have gone through a transformation. And this new budget process, each college will have their own P&L. So we'll know that, I'll give an example. This is true for every program in the country. Music programs are just expensive to run. The way they set up with instruments, the individual instruction, they're just expensive to run. Doesn't matter where you're at. Are we going to have a music program moving forward? Absolutely. It's a key part of who we are. And to do that, the college that has music knows, it's also has communications, that if we have more communication majors, it's easier for us to support music. And now the decision is going to be at the level where the dean and the college can make those type of decisions. And when you align the decision making with the accountability and the authority, now we start getting creative on how we tackle some of these issues. We absolutely want a music department, and here's how we're going to make that happen. And we've turned the entire university into partners in thinking through that process.
Mm-hmm. Which brings up, and we're almost at the end of the time, but you have just raised such an interesting point with this. How are your deans going to get involved in the enrollment process?
Boy, so it's interesting. They're going to get very involved, and part of their involvement is once they have these individual P&Ls, it's going to really start driving their interest in being engaged. Now, how do they influence that? I'm an old school business guy, right? So I was a business dean for a number of years, and we talk about in the marketing space the 4 Ps: product, pricing, placement, and promotion. And probably the biggest P on that is product. So if you're not offering the right academic programs, you're not getting the enrollments you want. It's very common to want to throw that issue over into enrollment services, but the reality is the product is probably driving that as much as anything. Mm-hmm. And once as a dean, you have a P&L statement that really helps you understand that. You become great partners with the enrollment service folks and saying, okay, what kind of programs do I need to be offering? What kind of programs do I need to be doing to attract the right student? And then they become partners in that process. And that's how they become real advocates in the enrollment process.
So there's that piece, there's the market research, and then there's getting the faculty on board with what's actually going on and what will be going on so that the courses can change, can be innovated, can be upgraded to make sure that you're teaching relevant stuff to the students coming through.
Absolutely. And when that goes well, the resources with an incentive-based budget model, the resources will follow. My expectation is you'll see a very quick adjustment around, okay, what programs do we really want to do? Well, there are going to be some that maybe aren't the most profitable, and that's okay. But if we're making that decision, we have to make that in the context of here are the ones that will offset that. Again, that's the kind of thing that I get excited about. We talked about issues of governance. I perhaps prefer the term shared engagement, right? And this is a way to get everybody engaged in the health and well-being of the university. And when they see the financial impact of the decisions they make, and they feel the financial impact of the decisions they make, I think the entire university starts benefiting from those kind of activities.
I think you're absolutely right. So, Stephen, it's been a pleasure. 3 takeaways for your university colleague presidents.
It's a great question. So one of the key takeaways, we started out talking about this. The change is happening. And one of the things that I think you hear a lot about is when things get back to normal, that's not going to happen, right? It's not going to happen, I don't think, any time in my lifetime. So recognize that the shift that is happening is here to stay. So that would perhaps be observation number 1, key takeaway. The other key takeaway that I would really push is we tend to, as individuals, put much greater emphasis on loss than we do on gains. It's a human psychology tendency. I would say don't see this as a loss, see this as an opportunity. The shifting of the market, we as leaders in higher education today, unlike colleagues over the last 100 years, really have an opportunity to shape the future of higher education in a way that has never existed in over 100 years. Boy, see it as an opportunity. And the other key takeaway, that I guess my third key takeaway then, and to do that, we absolutely have to become more market-centric as an industry. It's not about us, it's about the people we serve. And if we can do that well, if we really spend the time to really understand the needs and interests of today's students, I actually think, despite whatever people talk about in terms of future enrollment, if we can focus on really serving the needs and interests of today's students, the future for higher education is very bright.
I couldn't agree with you more. So thank you.
Yeah.
What's next for you? What's next for Bradley?
We've began this process of a fundamental shift on how we operate, this much more externally focused, building the institution around what today's students are looking for. The 2 things we're really focusing on right now, because this is what today's students want. Now, of course, that will shift in the future as we continue to be sensitive to what the students of today want. 2 things that we see as absolutely critical is a much greater focus on inclusivity. So you'll hear a lot more about that coming. That was a strong theme from every student we talked to. They want an environment that is inclusive in its nature. So we're working very hard to create a more inclusive environment. And then this idea of this multidisciplinary engaged learning, where it's not about degree, it's not even about career, it's about life of meaning, life of purpose. And how do we design the organization around doing that? And you're going to see a lot more about that in the years to come from Bradley University.
Well, that's great. Stephen, it has been an incredible pleasure. I thank you so much for being on this show and really look forward to having you back again sometime.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure.
Our next episode will be our 100th podcast. And to celebrate that mark, we have a special guest, Dr. Dan Greenstein, Chancellor of the Pennsylvania State System of Higher Education. As you know, Dr. Greenstein and PASHE have been in the news a lot lately as they're in the process of an integration which is combining 6 of its institutions into 2. And he'll be joining us to talk about the integration, how it's going, and what are the keys for presidents who are considering doing a merger or an acquisition.
Changing Higher Ed is a production of The Change Leader, a consultancy committed to transforming higher ed institutions. Find more information about this topic, along with show notes on this episode at changinghighered.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to the show, and we would also value your honest rating and review. Email any questions, comments, or recommendations for topics or guests to podcast@changinghighered.com. Changing Higher Ed is produced and hosted by Dr. Drumm McNaughton, post-production by David L. White.